Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the day today and the final session for our celebrations of 40 ICSEs and the 50th anniversary of the Garmisch meeting. My name is David Rosenblum, and Nino Medvedovich and I will be co-chairing this session. I must say, Nino and I were absolutely delighted to be given the opportunity to organize these celebrations, and in particular to organize this session that's coming up. And actually, to get into the spirit of things, Nino and I went and dug out some photographs of us circa 1968. The two of us were innocent and blissfully unaware of what was going on in software engineering at the time, particularly Nino, because he was born just 3 days before the start of the Garmisch meeting. And for myself, a little bit older there, as you can tell. I was in third grade, and as I found out just last week, I was in the same grade in the same elementary school in Dallas, Texas, as the son of one of our panelists, Bob McClure. So a very strange and very interesting connection to learn about just last week. Right, so for the next hour then, we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1968 NATO Software Engineering Conference, and we're going to be doing that with 5 of the attendees of that meeting. First of all, we'll be hearing a talk by Brian Randell. Brian has, as you perhaps know, was one of the co-editors of the report of the Garmisch meeting, as well as the successor meeting that took place the following year in Rome. He's also been an important representative and chronicler of the legacy and impact of the Garmisch meetings over the years. Every 10 years or so, ICSE and other venues have been celebrating anniversaries of the Garmisch meeting, and Brian has very dutifully come forward to share his recollections and observations about the way that the field has evolved. And I know we're going to be very interested to hear about his reflections on this very important 50th anniversary. So, for example, here in the middle there is a nice photo of Brian. I don't know if he's even seen this photo. This photo comes courtesy of Manfred Breu. That's a photo of Brian speaking at the 4th ICSE conference in Munich in 1979, when there was a full panel looking at both the past, present, and future of software engineering. So we'll be hearing from Brian in a moment, and once Brian has finished his talk, we'll have a panel discussion, an informal discussion with Brian and his 4 colleagues, and I'll mention their names now, but we'll invite them on the stage once Brian is finished. So first of all, we have Gerhard Goss, who's here with us. We also have Bob McClure, Doug McElroy, and finally, whoops, I went too fast there, finally Manfred Paul. So the 4 of them are here with us, and I won't bother to put that slide back up now, just so that we can make sure that we move things along. We've got a lot of things that we want to do and make a lot of time available for questions from us and also questions from you. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Brian up onto the stage so that we can hear his presentation. Please welcome Brian.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and my thanks to the organizers for the kind invitation to come and help celebrate this anniversary. I haven't actually been in the practice of celebrating every 10 years, but I have 2 or 3 occasions before being at ICSE at such meetings. So, I'm going to talk about something which was back in 1968. A lot of you will not know quite how tumultuous a year 1968 was with respect to the world. I'm not talking just computing. That was the year when Warsaw, Poland, was invaded by 5 of the Warsaw Pact countries. It was the year when both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. I was living in the States at the time and remember being driven through Manhattan on the evening of that second assassination by an absolutely scared taxi driver, past groups of police at every main intersection. It was really quite something. That was burnt, still is burnt into my memory. It was the time of lots of anti-Vietnam War protests and of student protests in Europe, particularly in Paris, but not only in Paris. And all of that was happening in 1968. So politically, that positions the time view. But enough about that sort of politics. Let me switch to talking about the NATO conference. This was a sponsored conference on software engineering held in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a place which should be in a previous site of the Winter Olympics in Bavaria, near the Alps. Absolutely glorious place. And that is the one photograph that I had of the hotel afterwards. So, as has just been mentioned, on several of the anniversaries, I've been invited to reminisce and to comment, perhaps naively, on the then, present, and the future. This is rather awkward. I didn't want to. It's very bad to be asked to reminisce several times, because you start talking not about your memories, but your memories of your memories, and your memories of your memories of your memories, if you see what I mean. So a very simple way of avoiding that is that I'm going to use a few, 2 or 3 slides, which I did use much earlier. So those that are as accurate now as they were then, they're at least not more inaccurate. I was invited to speak at ICSE in 1979, the 10th anniversary of the second of the NATO conferences. And that was, in fact, the first time I had spoken or done anything whatsoever to do with software engineering after the Rome conference, where I was so appalled by the Rome conference that I took a vow to have nothing whatsoever to do with software engineering. And I stuck to that vow until 1979. Why did I do that? Because in 1968, the conference on software engineering was very clear that the term software engineering was expressing a need, not expressing a reality. 1 year later, a number, particularly of the academics at the second conference, automatically assumed that what they were doing now merited the term software engineering. And it was so manifestly obvious to me that they didn't. And the conference, in many other ways, was a very disappointing effect, a disappointing affair that I decided to have nothing to do with it. But at ICSE 1979, there were 4 keynote talks, 2 at the beginning and 2 at the end. I was invited to talk about software engineering as it was. Barry Baim, who is here at the conference, I think I saw him here in the hall now, to talk about software engineering as it is. Edsger Dijkstra, the late Edsger Dijkstra, on software engineering as it should be, and the late Vlad Tursky on software engineering as it will be. A 4th talk, which was essentially an antidote to the third talk. The next few slides are largely from my 1979 talk. Some of you in the hall will not need reminding what computing was like in the 1960s. But I would guess a lot of you can have very little idea as to how different things were. Computers were very big. A computer was something that you could walk into sometimes. And very often that was what the engineers had to do. They were the sort of thing that cost millions of pounds or dollars and were bought by large organizations, governments and the like in the main. just the first of the mini computers was starting to appear, and those were being used in very well-funded laboratories. The idea of the personal computer had not arrived. There's a long, long list of things that had not arrived. Databases, networks, distributed systems, those had not been invited yet. Local area networks were not known. Long-distance networking, the beginning of the ARPANET, that had started, but that was it. The term software was being used. The term software engineering was not being used. When years ago I looked back, I did manage to find a very few written references to software engineering predating 1968. But in general, software was something, or system software was something that was provided free in the sense of already paid for, free with hardware. And application software were normally designed especially for particular environments and computers. The notion of software as a commodity, that did not exist. So, as I said, system software was usually provided free. When you moved to a new computer, basically you typically had to start all over again and rewrite or redesign the software that you were using. Seems a crazy idea now, but that's what it was like then. Many organizations, particularly large organizations, were finding themselves becoming increasingly dependent on computer systems and software systems. On the other hand, and this was something that came out very much during the '68 conference, a lot of these very large projects were far from successful. The phrase underestimates and over expectations is from the title of a paper by John Licklider, surveying, I think, about 20 or 30 huge American, mainly military, command and control systems and the like. Not one of which had met its budget or its timetable. Quite a lot of which, in fact, not even managed to become operational. So that was part of the background. It was only the next year when IBM unbundled its software. That was not a voluntary act, I should point out. When IBM unbundled its software, then software started to become a commodity. The NATO conference was planned, as far as I remember, by Fritz Bauer, Professor Bauer of Munich, and Professor Bollier of Grenoble, and I've suddenly gone blank on the name of the Scandinavian third professor. I and Peter Nauer were invited to edit a report that would come from this, but I do not recall having any input into the organization of the conference or the selection of the attendees. But the selection of the attendees, I think, was done very, very well, because it brought together a whole set of people from academic research, industrial research, and industry, from a great variety of countries, an awful lot of whom knew only a few other people at the conference beforehand. And that, I think, was a major factor in the impact and in the success of the conference. Many of the participants afterwards were saying that it had changed their future research plans. I read some years later that when Al Perlis received the copies of the report of the conference, he walked down into the Carnegie Mellon Computer Science postgraduate research room with a great bundle of these blue reports, and handed them out to all the students saying, "Read this, it'll change your lives." I was very pleased to read that many years later. It's one of the most flattering things I've ever seen. Peter Nauer and I should explain, the whole idea of the conference from the beginning was that it should produce a report. And quite a bit of the discussion at the conference was on the structure of the intended structure of the report. So in the following week in Munich, Peter Nauer and I, with some helpers, had the task of fleshing out the report. And doing so using the tapes of the discussions and the various position papers that had been written before and at the conference. I was absolutely delighted when Doug McElroy, one of my colleagues down the front there, described our report as a triumph of misapplied quotation. I have treasured that remark ever since. The 69 conference, I think I've said some of this already, was one in which there was a lot of acrimony. It was in a much less attractive, Rome is attractive, the hotel chosen was far from attractive. The discussion sessions opened up gaps rather than formed good relationships. Tom Simpson, of IBM, the designer of one of the very early sort of proto-operating systems, produced a wonderful one-page account. Well, it was he gave a presentation which, when written down, took a page. On masterpiece engineering. He claimed that the previous night he'd been walking in the hotel garden and had fallen over a stone and read on the stone that said, here in 1568, a group of artists and sculptors and other masterpiece makers were debating the problems of their profession, the low productivity and the like. Go and read that one page. It's great. I'll make just one quote from it, I believe, on the next slide. Here we are. Regrettably, none of these advances in knowledge seem to have any impact on masterpiece production, and so at length the group decided that the basic difficulty was clearly a management problem. One of the brighter students, by the name of L. Da Vinci, was instantly promoted to manager of the project, putting him in charge of procuring paints, canvases, and brushes for the rest of the organization. That talk, that impromptu talk, killed stone dead a hidden agenda that not I, but other people had on this second conference, which was to convince, to con NATO into setting up an Institute of Software Engineering. That there were some discussions on that up to the masterpiece engineering talk, but thereafter the idea was dead, stone dead. So you can find the two reports on the web. You can find the masterpiece engineering on the web, and also a great number of photographs, most of them by Bob McClure, and Bob McClure is here as well today, I'm pleased to say. Jumping forward quite a time to just 10 years ago, I was invited to give a talk, reminiscences and my views of the subject. And one of the main comments that I made then is one I'd like to repeat now, which was to point out that though there are many types of industry, of software industry now at the moment, there is a software industry which has grown up. It took quite a while for it to come into existence. Almost certainly the most important event which caused it to come into existence was the personal computer. Then you started having a software package industry, and software, instead of being something which was like bespoke tailoring, was an off-the-peg situation. And Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest started to happen. affected a bit by lawyers and commerce and so on. But all of a sudden, it seemed to me that all sorts of incredibly wonderful software was generated through this process of competition and, as I say, survival of the fittest and evolution. And that is a totally different sort of situation that existed in 1968. And it is something that I think we do well to remember and think in terms of how that sort of software, that sort of environment changes things. Instead of giving you my opinions, let me talk in terms of a couple of experts. A colleague of mine, Ian Somerville's book, Software Engineering, now in its 10th edition, is an absolutely massive compilation of all of the software techniques and the likes. And Ian argues the subject really needs to be treated as covering a whole range of different sub-disciplines. His definition of software engineering is what I want to quote, that it's an engineering discipline that's concerned with all aspects of software production from the early stages of system specification through to maintaining the system after it's gone into use. Dave Parnas was quoted earlier today. He gives a much more critical view of software engineering, at least he did a few years ago. He suggests that the most accurate term for most people who are called software engineers would be paid software designers. He's not willing to use the accolade engineers to describe most of those people, saying that even the professional engineers amongst that group almost certainly have got their professional engineering qualification in something other than software. Well, I'm leaving you to read that rather typically Parnas quotation, suggesting that only when agreement has been reached on the core body of knowledge that is required of somebody to be a software engineer, and there is a licensing scheme that ensures that the licensees have that knowledge, will we have people who are worthy of the term, who deserve the term professional software engineer. In English, the word engineering is used in a couple of senses, and I fear that the most important sense sometimes is the cynical one. To engineer something is to have a devious way of doing something. If I'm an engineer at all, it's of that type, I'm afraid. So, how does software engineering differ from programming? To my great surprise, Dave Parnas credits me with what he regards as the best definition of that distinction. He credits me with the phrase, the multi-person development of multi-version programs. That's the sort of thing that software engineers do as opposed to mere programmers. The only problem is I can't justify his claim. I can't remember having said that, and I can't find anywhere where I've written it down. Mind you, I hope he's right, because I like the phrase, and I'm happy to try and take the credit. What I find a little strange, though, is neither Ian Somerville nor Dave Parnas make the distinction that I think is really rather critical between off-the-peg software and bespoke software. Between the sort of large software which is produced for one particular environment, for one particular client, sometimes absolutely de novo, with some terrible and terribly difficult and complex requirement that has to be satisfied first time in case something awful happens. That's the sort of notion I have of bespoke software, as opposed to the off-the-peg software, which often evolves into respectability. There is a certain large software company that's famous for producing systems where only the third one of a particular line is likely to be at all satisfactory. But by the time you've gone through that, you start having really very good software. The sort of systems of concern in 1968 were all bespoke systems. And they were all, as far as I could see, related to, they violated the rule that I quoted at the bottom there from a wonderful book called Systemantics. It's an apparently humorous book, which the more you read it, the more you realize it isn't funny at all. And the line at the bottom there, a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. That's something very much people forget at their peril. We still have large bespoke systems, so I'm afraid we still have lots of the problems, or the modern equivalent of the problems that we had in 1968. There's one particular large bespoke system that I know a fair bit about, and I've just got a couple of slides about that. And that's the system that the UK National Health Service was trying to acquire, called NPFIT, National Programme for Information Technology. It was claimed in 2005 to be the world's biggest civil IT project. That already sounds to me to be an incredibly dangerous boast, and it was. This was intended to provide an online service for use by 40,000 GPs, doctors, 80,000 other doctors in hospitals and the like, 350,000 nurses. You can go on reading the numbers. A large online system for satisfying that lot of people in all sorts of sub-applications based on computerized clinical records and the like. I was involved in a major public campaign to get this project evaluated before any more millions of pounds were spent on it. I and a group of 22 other professors of computing science wrote a letter to the London Times, which created quite a stir. We created a 400-page dossier of concerns about this system. I testified to a parliamentary committee in exactly the same sort of environment, the same sort of room that all sorts of people have been testifying recently from Cambridge Analytica and the like, exactly the room that Mark Zuckerberg refused to come to. And I testified about that system's huge size and its complexity, its over-centralized approach to system specification and acquisition, and its the extremely demanding dependability and security requirements. The Public Accounts Committee, another parliamentary committee, probably the most powerful one, later described the project as the worst and most expensive contracting fiasco in the public sector history. It was abandoned in 2011, having cost £20 billion. I guess you might say that was one of my bigger I told you so's. On the left there is the front cover of our dossier. That's still available online. On the right there, they're the sort of things that are in the dossier. There were lots of stories in the press about how things were going wrong. There were a number of parliamentary reports, like that one on the electronic patient record. There were a lot of professional scientific papers and the like. And we've got quotes from all of those in this 400-page document. So that is the one comment I'd like to make about bespoke systems and their dangers. Just briefly on standards in software. This was another issue I raised at ComSac, and what I felt was that there were a ridiculous number of different software languages and software developments. 10 years ago, the History of Programming Languages roster or register of programming of languages listed 8,512 languages. Now it's 8,945. I think that means it's slowing down a bit, but it's still something that I find very difficult to justify. You could say that our field has grown greatly. One can question whether it has matured. So, let me bring this diatribe to an end. I started my talk in 1979 with quoting the great Cambridge historian Geoffrey Elton. "The future is dark, the present burdensome. Only the past, dead and finished, bears contemplation. Those who look upon it have survived it. They are its product and its victors. No wonder, therefore, that men," sorry, he missed out women, "that men and women concern themselves with history." Another favorite quotation of mine has been given already a couple of times this morning, though I will now quote it correctly. "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," by George Santayana. I hope you'll forgive me for having chosen to concentrate mainly on matters historical and to avoid just spending half an hour here stroking you and telling you what a wonderful subject you are pursuing and how well you are doing. And let me hurriedly say that a lot of great work is done. What I'm questioning is how far we are from having something that is worthy of being called an engineering and discipline. So I urge you to take some time to read or reread the first, don't bother with the second, the first of the NATO reports, and also the papers by Barry Baim, Vlad Tursky, and Edgar Dijkstra that they wrote back in 1979. Before you resume your work inventing yet another language and yet another technique. Thank you.
Please go ahead. Okay. So at this point, I would like to invite Brian to have a seat, and I'll call up onto the stage our other panelists. See if I can get this slide to work correctly this time. Yes. First of all, Gerhard Goos. Bob McClure. Doug McElroy. And Manfred Paul. So they've come up a little bit out of order. That was first Gerhard, Manfred, Bob, and then Doug, of course. Okay, and at this point, we'll have a somewhat informal conversation with these gentlemen. We have a couple of questions of our own that we would like to ask them, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to hear questions from you. Once again, we have microphones at the front of the room and also along the aisle there between the two sections of the auditorium.
Okay, I think we can get started, right? So I'll start off with hopefully an easy question, which is not going to be unexpected, but I'll put a caveat in there as to what you can give as or what you cannot give as your answer. So from the meeting, the conference you had in 1968, what did you expect coming out of it, and how does that differ? In what ways did the world surprise you? And possibly in what ways did it disappoint you, the world of software engineering? And the answer you cannot give is the conference from 1969. So that answer is off the table. So in any order you feel comfortable.
Well, we start there.
Well, from my point of view, the conference in '68 was already a consolation. Fritz Bauer had tried to produce a software engineering institute starting in 1966. I was myself involved in those talks in '67, and the conference in '68 was there to explore the field and find out what should be done or could be done. That was the main point. What I got from the conference was the importance of requirements engineering. That was positive. But software maintenance was a completely neglected field. It happened at the end of the software life cycle and was a small piece. And the fact that 70 or 80% of our time goes into software maintenance, that was not known.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I believe that what was the most unexpected result in the last 50 years is the tremendous mass of data that we can handle nowadays. To the extent everyone can realize, if we just ask any question whatsoever, the answer is almost at present in a minute or maybe in a second. You may believe that this is so for all the time, but that was not so in '68. I can tell you it was a very, very hard thing to find something which you knew was somewhere there. That was the most unexpected. And the most disappointing is I find it particularly very deplorable that we have not yet found efficient methods to either prevent or even bar the misuse of electronic and social media. That is a catastrophe. Every day we have bad news about fake informations or misdirected data, regardless whether they are done unwittingly or with criminal intent. Apparently, that's my main idea. Apparently, there are too many informaticians and/or users of social media who simply don't observe the unwritten code of good practice.
Thank you. Bob.
In 1968, I had just come off a 10-year career in industry, but not academia, and I had joined Southern Methodist University with the thought possibly of becoming having an academic career. And since I was in a newly minted what was called computer science curriculum, I had no real earthly idea of what needed to be taught to people to be able to practice what was certain to become a major source of employment for the country, because it was pretty clear at that time that computers were going to become ubiquitous in our lives and they would all need software. I had started as an electrical engineer, electronics engineer, for which there is a long discipline, and I was hoping that we would find the same historical disciplines for software. And I listened to these papers. I was enthusiastic because a lot of people said things that I thought was very good. I took it to heart. I went back and I developed some programs along those lines. And then we came back a year later, and I came to the Rome conference. And in echoing what Brian had said, I found that it was a serious disappointment because effectively no progress had been made. Nothing had been done to really establish what I call a true engineering discipline, which he recited several quotations, which I won't recite again, to that end. And that's basically my view. I was very optimistic in '68, much less optimistic in '69.
I was sent to Brussels by Ed David, who was our director at Bell Laboratories at the time, to participate in the creation of the list of invitees. It had already been decided that this conference would be held. And as it was said, there was some subtext, but I don't know, I am not really cognizant of where it began, that this might lead to a NATO institute. It's the only time I crossed the Atlantic Ocean in first class, because it was a one-day trip to Brussels and back. Somebody had put together a very good list of contacts around the world to create the list of people who arrived at this conference. It was eye-opening. It was exciting just for the title. That put a new perspective on the business we were in. The word computer science had been invented a few years before, and departments were springing up around the academic world on computer science. Sometime later, Fred Brooks said, if you have to call it a science, it isn't, and citing Christian Science and mortuary science as evidence for that. And I asked Fred about that this morning, and he said he effectively said it shouldn't have been called computer science. It should have been engineering, because that is the topic of what we do when we build both computers and software. After the conference, the hope was that this would become a real engineering discipline. One of the a modern requirement for engineering is that there's some science behind it. And one of the things that's pleased me since the conference is the rise of formal methods. And one of the things that's disappointed me is the fact that, at least in the United States, they have not been accepted as part of standard practice. I think that's all I wanted to say at this point.
Okay. Thank you. Brian?
I don't really have much to add to what I've already said. When I mentioned that several people said that the '68 conference had changed their view, one prime example would be Edsger Dijkstra. He and others were very much motivated by discussions at that conference to start thinking in terms of formal methods of producing programs that were intended and expected to be correct ab initio. I find it, in retrospect, quite funny that a year or so later, the effect that it had on me was of getting involved in the idea of what can we do to increase our ability to depend on software that we know has got bugs in it, but we don't have any means of guaranteeing that we've got rid of them all. And essentially of extending the notion of fault tolerance from hardware, where it was well established, to software. And that was a subject that I then spent with colleagues many years afterwards, and which I still think is an appropriate complement to work on formal methods. I think it's a very good idea to try and make sure your software has got no bugs in it. It's a very bad idea to put your complete reliance on having succeeded.
Amplifying that, on that a little bit, I expressed my disappointment in formal methods not being accepted much. They've barely begun to percolate into IDEs. And in fact, if I look at a modern IDE, the first time I saw one described was at the 1968 conference. Bob Beamer effectively described a modern IDE there. His IDE didn't happen to have syntax coloring, something that I've never understood myself. Would you read English language? Prefer to see your novels with the adjectives a different color from the nouns? So indeed, our accepted practices in managing projects, which lead to the universal use of IDEs, just hasn't absorbed any of the science lessons, or many of the science lessons that we have learned in the interval.
Over the years, I've given several talks concerning the distinction between science and engineering, and it's strictly applicable to computer science and software engineering. That is, that science really is concerned about discovering the truth, new information, learning. Engineering is concerned about finding a good, if not the best, compromise. And designing software is always a compromise, and therefore it should be called engineering. However, we have not yet developed the technology to discover what really amounts to what is a good compromise. We don't know. This is always left up to the individual who plucks his ideas right out of the air. And he says, I'm going to do it this way as opposed to that. Simple example. You can write a 3-line software program which is guaranteed to work under any and all circumstances. It may run slowly, called an exchange sort, or you can write a very complicated sort which will run very fast most of the time. Which one do you pick for a particular application? Always up to the individual. We don't have any techniques whereby we can make that rational choice outside of just leaving it up to the man who did it.
I should like to make one remark regarding the '68 conference, which has nothing to do with the immediate result and whatever it seminates. in the following the future. That was said by Brian very nicely and very fully. But I want to say what seems, if you haven't read the report, then you don't know that more than 50 attendees were there from 11 countries, including even the partly countries behind the Iron Curtain. And there was almost an even split between academia and industry. That, I think, is something which was very, very fruitful for all participants in that conference, particularly that industry was there, not only academia. Now, in this, at this point, David Rosenblum has asked also, what about Article 68? Did it play a major role? It's an interesting question because Article 68 was ill-advised from the beginning and did, of course, did create very heated discussions, but not so much in the Rome meeting. There were some critical remarks, but it did not go into depth discussing that. I just say it died out, as most of you may know, very soon, because in Working Group 2.1, which had a meeting the same year, 68, it was heated, very, very, heated.
There's one.
Where the British, mainly the British participants, members of our group, who made clear that this is impossible. Impossible development which leads to nowhere without helping anyone. And so Article 68 died. But then I want to make at least one defending word for Algol, the Algol as such. Algol was, as only very few people whom I meet today in meetings and talk with them about Algol, they don't really know that Algol played a very, very important role in these days that we are talking about now. Between 62 and 65, probably even a little later, there was a group formed by universities in Europe and the University of Illinois in the USA, called the Alcor Group, and they had a normed part of Algol, mainly Article 68, as it was published with minor reductions. And this compiler was normed by this part was normed by a compiler called Alcor. And those universities who formed that group really used the same language in their compilers, whether it's IBM 7094 or whatever it was, or any European computers at that time. A normed language that could be used for publishing mainly numerical analysis procedures. And that it did not really live longer than about 10 or 12 years as a compiler, as a language used, is really not the reason that it was not worth it. That quotation was used today already by Professor Brooks in the morning that is it worth considering quotation of Niklas Wirth, who was working in this area also. Now, that's what I wanted to say, that Argol had some impact on the development later. What it missed and what it forgot was to add the class concept, which first in 1977 with Ole Jan Dahl from
67.
Norway in Simula 77.
67, Manfred. You've missed 10 years. 67.
67, thank you. Okay, thank you. There you find the class concept, which is so important, of course, in modern languages as Java. That was a failure of Argol. Okay.
Thank you.
One aspect of the conference, nothing to do with technical, is worth noting, and it's been repaired. There were no women participating. At the time, I wasn't even conscious of it, and that says a lot.
I'll also make the comment that every man wore a business suit and a tie.
Is that good or bad?
I'll make some comment about languages. He commented that the Hopel list of 8,900 and some odd, I haven't examined it and done the counts, but I would doubt very seriously that more than a double handful are used by more than 10 people today. There are a lot of what I call personal languages. I've got a few myself that people use, and they say, of course it's in use. I use it daily, but it's not used by anybody else. If you look at the history of languages, a very large number have come and gone. For example, PL1. Does anybody in this audience remember PL1? There are a few. I see some hands. What about Algol? How many people have actually written a program in Algol? There are a few people who've done that too. How many people use them today? I don't see any hands. Now there are
two hands up there.
Yeah, there are a couple. There are a couple. I'm not saying there's nobody, but remember I was saying the body of people who use some of these languages is extremely small. I am told that there are, something like 8,000 human languages in the world, of which the vast number are used by less than 100 people. And I think that's probably true. That's the way programming languages are headed as well. They will be used, but only by a very few people.
Okay.
Something I couldn't squeeze in this time, but it's in one of all these other reminiscences, is a lovely quote from a British academic 10 years ago, listing all the different languages that he and his colleagues found they were having to mark student projects on. He lists a long list of language, a ridiculously long list of languages, and suggests that probably the only thing that was missing was Etruscan.
Okay. I was personally involved in the design and implementation of Argo 68 at that time, but I did not see any direct correlation between software engineering conference and these language issues. But it was clear at that time that the progress in producing software would not come from the improvement of programming languages. And I think that's true also today. My personal consequence was when I moved from Munich to Karlsruhe in '71, I acquired a Simula 67 compiler, and my students were probably the first ones in the world who learned object-oriented programming already in 1972, 20 years before everybody else did. So much about the correlation between language and software engineering. But another problem was that the Garmisch conference had much too much focus on management problems. Clear, management of software teams is an important part for every director of software development. But management is not a part of software engineering. It's a part of social engineering. And that has been tossed together in much too much in '68 and in the years afterwards. It's only now that we restrain and come back to the fact that software engineering is concerned with properties of software, not with properties of the people who do it.
Okay.
And that those things should be separated. As far as the Rome conference is concerned, my complaint is that already in the Garmisch conference, design and implementation of software were seen as something which falls together, in contrast to other engineering disciplines, where design is preparing for production, but production is a separate issue. But in software engineering, we have that together. And that's a mistake which goes on also today, that design issues and production issues, programming issues are convoluted and are seen as being one piece. We should much more concentrate on the idea that we need to design software as consisting of something which you may call components or modules or statements or whatever large objects you have. And that afterwards, the production, which is programming, is a different issue. And the Rome conference in particular had the problem that they mixed that up with the result that everybody who was experienced in programming meant that when he is speaking about programming, then he would cover the kernel of software engineering, which is definitely wrong. And that was a failure.
So,
Sorry, just one quickie. The word components was used then. One of the things you should definitely read or reread in the '68 report is the text of Doug's talk on components. He was suggesting that the lack of standardized families of components and abilities to build systems out of sort of parameterized components was one of the major things that was needed. His talk even now makes you realize how far we've still to go, but it is noticeable that in the years that followed, at least one world of absolutely splendid system building using components, the Unix world, did flourish. Yeah. And of course, Doug was slightly involved in that.
Yeah. Yes, maybe let Doug have the final word then before we have to close off this panel, unfortunately.
I have one question for everybody. There were 55 attendees at the '68 conference. There were a few more at the '69 conference, but only 20 of the first at the '68 conference attended the second. I don't know why that number was so low. Does anybody know?
Well, in my personal case, I was invited to the conference, and I saw what was on offer, and I'm afraid it just didn't live up. It didn't live up to its title. Techniques of Software Engineering. It was going to tell us how to do what we had said we needed to do. And it just didn't look like it was going to, so I didn't go to Rome.
You anticipated the problem.
Okay, unfortunately, I have to play the bad guy here and close off this discussion. I mean, these guys have made the job very easy for me and Nino. They had a very nice conversation going here, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to be the one to cut it off because I know we are on a very tight schedule for the rest of this session and also to make it to the banquet. I believe these gentlemen will be attending the banquet this evening, if I'm not mistaken, so you'll have an opportunity to chat one-on-one with them in person. I'm sure they'd be very happy to chat with all of you, share some additional stories.
Or 1-on-5, really.
Or 1-on-5, however it works out, yes. But please, once again, join me in thanking these gentlemen for making their way to this conference and sharing their reminiscences about the 1968 conference. Okay, so now we'll have a slight change of configuration on the stage before we proceed with the next part of the session.
Okay. I'll do the slides. I'll switch over the slides. Oh, absolutely. Is this on? Can you turn this on? Oh, can you turn me on? All right. So while the changeover is happening, let me just explain what is going to take place over the next 40 minutes or so. So we actually have a double jubilee at this ICSE. This 1968 was the year of the first software engineering conference, so we're celebrating 50 years of that, but this is also the 40th ICSE. And one of the things that we wanted to do to mark the occasion was to basically have a, for lack of a better word, parade of previous chairs who are in attendance, who will come up in a minute. We'll explain the protocol, and you will get a chance to see who these people are. While this may strike you perhaps as somewhat inward-looking, the conference kind of celebrating itself, I think it's important that we do this. We only do it once every 10 years, and this just happens to be that year. And it's really fortuitous that our 30th, 40th, 50th, etc. ICSEs line up with the appropriate anniversaries of the Garmisch conference. So the thing that you should have received by now, and if you have not, you will be able to, because these books are coming, is a little compendium that we collected. David, Domenico Bianculi, and I edited this, but really the actual authors are all of the former chairs of, or most of the former chairs of the previous ICSEs. And for the young people in the audience, I know a couple of you have expressed some trepidation about walking up to people whose papers you have read and who are authors of a chapter or article contribution in this book, and you were nervous about asking them for an autograph. You have David's and my permission to do that, and they will be nice, and they will sign the appropriate page in the book, wherever you tell them to do so. So please do not hesitate.
So, so to kind of break things up, we're going to kind of work through 40 ICSEs here, and to kind of break up some of the potential monotony. We're not quite sure what to expect, but we're going to take a break every so often and throw in a few tidbits about past ICSEs, including some trivia questions for you to think about. So the first trivia question is, can you guess what this is a graph of? Now, if you've been to previous ICSEs in recent years, you've probably seen opening plots or graphs from the program co-chairs who tell you what the rate of arrival of submissions was throughout the period of submissions. That's not what this particular graph is about. I will give you one hint, though, what this graph is about. Think about it for a few seconds. See if you can figure out what this might be a graph of. Submissions and rejections. We have too many academics in the audience and not enough accountants. This is actually a graph of what the registration fee what the registration fee was for ICSE over the 40 instances of ICSE. I won't tell you what some of these exact numbers are because I think we have another trivia question about some of this, but you can see that things were pretty steady throughout the first 15 or so ICSEs, a steady rise, and then things got a little bit chaotic over the years. I think part of the explanation here, of course, is that every general chair wants their own particular ICSE to be much more fabulous and memorable and everything than all of the previous ICSEs combined. And so that partially accounts for the rise in registration fees. Of course, there are other things like inflation and other little details that get in the way, but that's just an example of some of the trivia that we were delighted to try to dig up about these past 40 ICSEs. Okay, so Another thing that we'll share with you is a little bit of information about the proceedings to the ICSE conferences. Your proceedings nowadays, you don't even have a physical thing that you have for your proceedings anymore. Those who are longtime attendees of ICSE, of course, will remember that the only way that they could ever get a copy of the proceedings was to lug home a very heavy book that they would have to pack into their luggage because there was no electronic media. Nowadays, though, the proceedings are just a PDF file sitting somewhere in the cloud. You'd access that through a web browser, copy it to your computer perhaps, and browse papers at your leisure. It wasn't always like that, as you'll be seeing later on. Okay, so without further ado, I think we're ready to start calling people up onto the stage to be recognized.
So what we're going to do is we will flip-flop with calling names. When your name is called, if you're in the audience, obviously, please come up. You will get a handshake from one of the two of us, and then you will be taken over by the ICSE 2018 organizers, and you'll be told where to sit or stand, and you will also get a nice plaque. So, without further ado, the 40th ICSE is this one. We're going to work our way backwards to make it interesting, because really, who wants to wait for Ivica, Marcia, and Mark? We know who they are, right? So you might as well come up right now. Marcia Chechik and Mark Harmon are the program co-chairs. You guys can actually come in the middle section. Ivica obviously is the general chair, so let's give him a hand.
Am I supposed to shake hands or just?
Yeah. Shake. Okay. So please, that way. So.
Okay. Mark.
Sorry, wrong way.
Okay, the 39th ICSE, just 1 year ago. Unfortunately, this is one that I missed in Buenos Aires. The program co-chairs were Alex Orso and Martin Robillard, and Alex is here. And the general chair, who wasn't able to attend this year, was Sebastian Nuchitel. Alex.
Okay, that skipped. Okay. ICSE 2016, or the 38th ICSE, was held in Austin, Texas. Laurie Dillon was the general chair. Will Trace was the finance chair. And the two program co-chairs were Willem Visser and Laurie Williams. Please come up.
Laurie. Well,
fancy seeing you here.
Laurie. Okay, the 37th ICSE was held in Florence. It was a great conference, but those of you who attended will, of course, remember the very nice social events that Antonia organized, the trip to the Uffizi Gallery and the very nice banquet that was held. Antonia Bertolino was the general chair, and the program co-chairs, Gerardo Canfora and Sebastian Elbaum.
The 36th ICSE was held in India, so that was a big treat. General chair was Pankaj Jalote, and the program co-chairs were Lionel Briand and Andrea van der Hoek.
Okay, the 35th ICSE was the ICSE held in San Francisco in 2013. This was somewhat of a sad ICSE, of course. David Notkin was the general chair. He passed away just a few months, 1 or 2 months before the conference. It was very nice that a number of people in our community rallied together to ensure the conference's success and to ensure a very positive legacy for David. In particular, Gail Murphy, Joe Atlee, Tom Zimmerman, and Bill Griswold were very instrumental in taking over from David. And then the program co-chairs were Betty Cheng and Klaus Pohl.
The 34th ICSE took place in Zurich, Switzerland, and the general chair was Martin Glintz. Gail Murphy, who could not be here, and Mauro Pezze were the program co-chairs.
Mauro. Okay, the 33rd ICSE. This was held in Honolulu. Keeping with the tradition of exotic locales for ICSE. Dick Taylor was general chair, and the program co-chairs were Harold Gall, who's not able to be here, and my esteemed co-chair, Nino Medvidovich.
Okay, so right around that time frame, this used to be your proceedings. So you got a pen drive to take home, which was a significant improvement over initially 1 volume and then 2 volumes of heavy paper. The proceedings came on this thing. You usually put them in your computer in the USB drive, downloaded it on your hard drive, and then use the pen drive for whatever else. So that was kind of the modern technology at that point. And as we promised to break things up a little bit, another trivia question at this point is, which cities have hosted ICSE more than once? Orlando?
San Francisco. Okay.
Austin? And I think this one is, the last one is a tough one because we're counting a conference as an ICSE 0, and we'll explain in a few minutes, but LA was the 4th one, so very good. All right, 32nd ICSE, ICSE 2010, was another one of those that's an absolute treat. It was held in Africa, in Cape Town, and the general chairs were Jeff Kramer and Judith Bishop. The program co-chairs, Prem Devambu and Sebastian Uchitel. Judith? Right. Great conference, fantastic food, wonderful wine.
Here we go. Okay, the 31st ICSE was held in Vancouver. If I'm not mistaken, that was the second Canadian ICSE. Steve Fickus was general chair, and our two program co-chairs are here, Joe Atley and Paola Inverardi.
30th ICSE, ICSE 2008, Leipzig, Germany. Again, fabulous ICSE. We got to see a wonderful performance by the symphony, excellent food, great scenery. Wilhelm Schaefer was the general chair. These two gentlemen, Matt Dwyer and Volker Grün, were the program co-chairs.
And some of these gentlemen were at the conference as well.
Oh, that is correct. That was the 30th ICSE, so keeping with our tradition of commemorating these 10-year advances of the field, we had a similar event 10 years ago.
Yes. Okay, the 29th ICSE was held in Minneapolis. General chair was John Knight, also somebody who regrettably has passed away, has left our community. And program co-chairs were Wolfgang Emmerich and Greg Rothermel.
I seem to be, I didn't actually realize this as we were divvying these up, I seem to be the one to describe the ICSEs in all these exotic locales. So ICSE 2006, the 28th ICSE, was in Shanghai. It was fabulous in more ways than one. The setting was absolutely spectacular, but also this was the ICSE that kickstarted the significant influx of fantastic research that has come out of China. General chair was Lee Osterweil, Dieter Rombach, and Mary Lou Sofa were program co-chairs, and there were two coordination chairs, Dehua Zhu and Koichi Kishida.
Peter? Yes, the 27th ICSE. So in this period, the rotation of conferences was basically the odd-numbered ICSEs were in North America. The even-numbered ICSEs were either in Europe or somewhere else in the world. So at least for people based in the U.S., me at the time, at least in the U.S., perhaps the North American ICSEs don't seem so exciting as the opportunity to go to Europe or to China or Cape Town or whatever it might be. But in any case, all of these conferences were very memorable in one way or another. 27th ICSE was held in St. Louis in 2005. General chair was Catalin Roman. And the program co-chairs were Bill Griswold and Bashar Nusseibeh. Bill had to leave the conference already. But Bashar is here.
26th ICSE, Scotland, Edinburgh, UK. Anthony Finkelstein was the general chair. Jacques Estoublier and David Rosenblum were the program co-chairs.
The 25th ICSE was held in Portland, 2003. The general chair was Lori Clark, who's coming up on stage. Program co-chairs were Lori Dillon, who's already up here, and Walter Tischi.
'24th ICSE, ICSE 2002, was an interesting one. It was supposed to be the first ICSE in South America. Because of the political climate in Argentina, in 2001, the steering committee decided to move the conference to a much more exotic locale, especially for us in the US, Orlando, Florida. It was actually a fantastic ICSE, especially under the circumstances. Will Trace, who is where? He was... There you are. Will Trace was the general chair. Jeff McGee and Michael Young were the program chairs.
Okay, so for those of you who are too young to remember, this is what an ICSE proceedings used to look like, an old-fashioned book. And as I said earlier, these things were given out as part of your conference bag, and then you would have to find space in your suitcase to carry it home, and hopefully not exceed the baggage allowance that you had on your airline ticket. So what you're seeing here are covers from the 16th through the 23rd ICSEs. You know, personally, I probably, a lot of the more senior members in the audience probably still have a lot of these on their own bookshelves. I certainly have all of these on my bookshelves. In fact, this is a photo of my own copy of these proceedings. So. Okay, more trivia then for you. These are going to be a little bit more difficult, I think. What is the shortest distance between two consecutive ICSEs, and correspondingly, what is the greatest distance between two consecutive ICSEs? And you've probably seen some of the ICSEs involved already on these, and you're going to have to try to use your knowledge of geography and the sizes and distances across oceans to try to figure out what the answer is. For the first question, the shortest distance between two consecutive ICSEs was kind of an accident. Shortest distances between the 2001 and 2002 ICSEs, between Toronto and Orlando. If the conference had taken place in Buenos Aires that year, then it certainly wouldn't have been the shortest distance, would have been much greater. The greatest distance between two consecutive ICSEs, but okay, so we have 2010 and 2011 general chairs here who are guessing that they have the greatest distance. Let's see if they're right. Okay. Third greatest distance between the 14th and 15th ICSEs from Melbourne to Baltimore. Second greatest, 31st to the 32nd, 2009 to 2010. And yes, we have some geographers on the stage, yes. The greatest distance was between Cape Town and Honolulu. Okay, and the 23rd ICSE, as you can kind of tell, I'm doing the odd-numbered ones. Nino's doing the even-numbered ones. 23rd ICSE, under the very capable organization of Hausi Mueller as general chair, and the program co-chairs Mary Jean Harold and Wilhelm Schaefer.
22nd ICSE, Limerick, Ireland. It took place at the university in Limerick. Also a very fun ICSE. Carlo Gezzi was the general chair. Carlo is walking after his hip surgery. Program co-chairs Mehdi Jazeri and Alex Wolf. And, sorry, I should also mention organization chair Kevin Ryan.
Okay, the 21st ICSE was held in Los Angeles in 1999 at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott Hotel. General chair was Barry Boehm. Is Barry?
Barry's right there. He's coming up.
There he is. Okay. Barry. And program co-chairs David Garland and Jeff Cromer.
Yeah, I know. 20th ICSE, we're halfway done. Kyoto, Japan. It took place in a spaceship. No, the conference center just looked like a spaceship. The conference was, the general chair of the conference was Koji Tori, Kokichi Futatsugi, and Dick Kemmerer were the program co-chair. Kokichi. Oh, that's right. Got a couple of the names. Takuya Katayama and the late David Notkin were technical co-chairs for this conference.
Okay, the 19th ICSE held in Boston in 1997. Rick Adrian was general chair, and the program coordinators, as they called themselves in the proceedings, were Alfonso Fujeta, Dick Taylor, who's already on stage, and Tony Wasserman. That's right.
18th ICSE, Berlin, Germany. Dieter Rombach, who is already on the stage, was general chair. Tom Maibaum and Marv Zelkowitz were the program co-chairs.
The The 17th ICSE was held in Seattle, 1995. Dwayne Perry as general chair, and Ross Jeffrey and David Notkin as program co-chairs.
And since this is the question that comes up all the time, ICSE, not about me personally, but about every individual in this room, for me, my first ICSE was ICSE 17. ICSE 16, Sorrento, Italy. I hear it was in an incredible setting. I wasn't there.
It was.
Bruno Fadini was the general chair. Axel van Lamsrode and Lee Osterweil, who is here already, were the program co-chairs. So you've already seen a set of books that look like this. These are the proceedings of the earlier ICSEs. Again, big books you had to carry around. At this time, the proceedings were somewhat smaller because the conference was somewhat smaller, and you probably could carry them without having to pay fees because the airlines had not become real jerks about it yet. So the baggage allowance was more reasonable. So here's a quick question. Does anybody know who served as general or program chair or co-chair for the greatest number of ICSEs? And I'll give you a hint. That person is on the stage right now. No. It's Barry Boehm.
Yes. Again, a bit of a trick question. Yes. Okay, the 15th ICSE was held in Baltimore in 1993, 25 years ago already. Vic Basili was general chair. Rich DeMello, who's making his way to the stage, was one of the program co-chairs, and Takuya Katayama was his colleague as co-chair, program co-chair.
ICSE 14, Melbourne, Australia. Tony Montgomery, who is no longer with us, was general chair. Program chairs were Laurie Clark and Carlo Getzi. And Carl Reed is walking up, and Carlo is still walking.
Okay, the 13th ICSE was held in Austin in 1991. Pay attention to this slide. It was held in 1991. General chair was Les Bellotti, and program chairs were David Barstow and Koji Tori.
Yeah. 12th ICSE, Nice, France. General chair, François-Régis Valette, and program co-chairs, Peter Freeman and Marie-Claude Godel.
The 11th ICSE was held in 1989 in Pittsburgh. Larry Druffel was general chair. Dinas Bierner and Dick Fairley were the program co-chairs. And the venue, this convention center, from what I understand, the David Lawrence Convention Center has been torn down and rebuilt in the intervening years. So we're starting to get into some of the ICSEs where even the venues don't exist anymore.
10th ICSE, Singapore. General Chair Tan Chin Nam, and program co-chairs Larry Druffel and Bertrand Meyer.
And the 9th ICSE, 1987 in Monterey. This, of course, was the ICSE where Lee Osterweil gave his talk on software processes, or Software 2. The general chair, Bill Riddle, program co-chairs Bob Balzer and Koichi Kishida.
Eighth ICSE, London, Imperial College, in fact. Alex Wolf's first ICSE, which I found out today. Manny Lehman was the general chair. Horst Hunke and Barry Boehm were the program co-chairs.
Yes, and I forgot to mention that the 9th ICSE in Monterey was my own first ICSE. So.
Okay.
And yes, here you see the covers of the earliest ICSE proceedings. If you read very carefully, you'll see that that first proceeding says National Conference on Software Engineering, not International Conference on Software Engineering. And in fact, that conference was kind of a sub-conference or a co-located meeting with CompCon, which used to be a very important general computer science meeting in those days, but is also something that is no longer with us. So,
Say something about that one.
Yes, and so perhaps we should explain a little about what ICSE 0 is. A lot of people call this SIGPLAN-sponsored International Conference on Reliable Software, which was held in April of 1975 in Los Angeles. A lot of people consider that to be the 0th ICSE because many of the same problems and themes and research discussions took place at that conference. Very similar to the kinds of things that were of concern to the ICSE series in the coming years. Okay, right, so you saw that plot of the registration fee. So what was the conference registration fee and the nightly hotel room charge at that first ICSE, NCSE 1? How much would it cost you to have attended that very first ICSE? Sorry? $200. You're all, $50. Okay, anybody want to split the difference there? Well, depending on your classification, student or a member or non-member or what have you, the registration fees were a very reasonable $20 to $30, and you could have stayed at the hotel. If you wanted to be really fancy, then yeah, maybe $200 for a couple of nights for the conference, even $300 if you stayed in one of these suites. But otherwise, if you were just a regular academic on a regular travel budget, you could probably have attended this conference for $100.
Yep.
A little bit different nowadays, I think.
You're a regular academic on a regular budget. You attend the conference and hotel for $100 and then spend $200 on wine.
Yeah, there you go. So right, just a reminder of how things have changed. Okay, the 7th ICSE, this was the first time that the conference was held in Orlando, was held at the Hyatt Orlando, 1984. Terry Strader was general chair, Bill Howden and Jean-Claude Rowe were the program co-chairs.
Sixth ICSE, Tokyo, Japan. Vic Basili and Hajime Enomoto were the general chairs, and Koji Kobayashi and Raymond Ye were the program co-chairs.
This was the first time that ICSE had been in Asia. The 5th ICSE was held in San Diego, 1981 at the Town and Country Resort. Seymour Jeffrey was general chair, and there was just one program chair at the time in those days for ICSE, Leon Stuckey.
4th ICSE, Munich, Germany. Friedrich Bauer was the general chair. Manny Lehman and Leon Stuckey were the program chairs.
And that was the ICSE that Brian was referring to in his talk. The 3rd ICSE was held in Atlanta. Maurice Wilkes, who I believe it was Fred Brooks mentioned this morning, and Les Bellotti were the organizers for that particular ICSE in Atlanta.
Second ICSE, Raymond Ye and Sivi Ramamurthy were the general and program chair, and the conference was held in San Francisco.
At the Jack Tar Hotel, which also doesn't exist anymore.
This venue doesn't exist anymore.
Yes. And the very first ICSE, or the NCSE, and there's not an easy way to say that verbally, was held in Washington, D.C., 1975, September, at the Mayflower Hotel. General chairs were Harlan Mills and Dennis Fife, and the program chair was Tom Steele.
And the very first one, ICSE 0, was held in L.A., the International Hotel, home of the famous Penthouse restaurant. I don't know if you can read that at the top. Martin Schumann and Raymond Ye were the general chairs. Barry Boehm and Tony Hoare were the program co-chairs. And that
I guess that brings us to the end. I mean, there are other trivia questions we could ask you, or if you have trivia questions of your own, maybe come up to one of us and we'll see if we can figure out the answer. In the meantime, though, we do hope you enjoy this collection of reminiscences that we've put together, and hope that you've enjoyed seeing many of the people who've been very instrumental in making this series of conferences a success over the 40-plus years of ICSE's existence. Okay, so I think we're supposed to have a photo taking out. Okay. Ah, okay. Why is the history of ICSE greater than 40 years if there have only been 40 ICSEs? So it was missing in 77, I guess. Yeah, it used to be every 18 months. I mean, that's the explanation for why it's off kilter. It would be spring of one year, fall the following year, fall the following year. There'd be a skipped year, and then it would start in the spring 2 years later. So, yeah.
Okay. Now you take your awards.
Okay.
And I take mine. And then we make a photo.
Okay.
Hey.
Wow.
Okay, great.
Meh.
Maybe putting this on a pen drive would have been. I know.
So for the dinner, there are.
We had that up there, I thought. That's why I said.
Do you want to carry one more of these home, though?